With Oscar season around the corner, critics are beginning to talk about the best films considered to be at the top. One early contender is The King's Speech, which premiered at the Toronto Film Festival in September. It is the story of the lifelong friendship between King George VI and his speech therapist, Lionel Logue. Here is the trailer for the film.
My husband is, he's required to speak publicly.
I have received...
Perhaps he should change jobs.
And what of my husband with a king? My husband has seen everyone.
Insert them into your mouth. Enunciate.
He hasn't seen me. I can cure your husband, but I need total trust. What was your earliest memory?
I'm not here to discuss personal matters.
Well, why are you here, then?
Because I bloody well stammer.
Do you know any jokes?
Timing isn't my strong suit.
Your methods were unorthodox and controversial.
Up comes your Royal Highness.
It's actually quite good fun.
Yes. Art thou afeard? It's your peculiar. I take that as a compliment.
War with Germany will come, and we will need a king whom we can all stand behind.
He's afraid of his own shadow.
The nation believes that when I speak for them. But I can't speak.
You could do it. You needn't be governed by fear.
It'll be like mad King George the Stammerer. Get up, you can't sit there, get up!
Why not? It's a chair.
That is St. Edward's chair.
People have carved their names.
Listen to me! Listen to me!
Why should I waste my time listening to you?
Because I have a voice!
Yes, you do.
Your greatest test is yet to come.
What's he say?
I don't know, but he seems to be saying it rather well.
Your first wartime speech.
Broadcast to the nation and the world.
This great time of crisis.
However this turns out, I don't know how to thank you.
Bertie, you're the bravest man I know.
I intend to be a very good queen, to a very great king.
Forget everything else and just say it to me.
Joining me is Colin Firth and the film's director, Tom Hooper. He directed the feature film, The Damned United, last year. I am pleased to have them both at this table. Welcome. This is a true story?
Yes, absolutely. Like all true stories, particularly those dealing with the royal family, we don't have verbatim records of everything that was said, but the extraordinary thing in our case is that 9 weeks before the shoot, through my wonderfully research-driven production designer Eve Stewart, we tracked down the grandson of the speech therapist Lionel Logue, and he had handwritten diaries
Lionel did.
Of his grandfather.
Right.
And this included, Bertie's medical report card, complete with the description of his weak diaphragm. And it was a treasure trove of information that no royal biographer has ever read, no historian has ever had access to, no member of the royal family has ever seen. And we got given the right to look at it and use it. And a couple of the funniest lines in the movie are written by King George VI and Lionel Logue. So, for example, there's a big speech in the film, and at the end, Logue turns to the king and says, "You still stammered on the W." And the king says, "Well, I had to throw in a few so they knew it was me." The last time those lines were spoken out loud were by King George VI and Lionel Logue. I mean, the frustration of the diaries was that they teasingly began with the coronation of the king. It was as if when Bertie was plain old Duke of York, no one thought it would be interesting to keep a diary of a relationship between a speech therapist and the Duke of York, which gives you some insight to his standing as the younger brother. So, for that early phase, we've had to rely on, very little information, but a lot our wonderful writer's imagination, David Seidler. But David Seidler was born in 1937, had a stammer as a child, and went through speech therapy in the 1940s. So the techniques he talks about in the film are only, 10 years away from our story.
Who first saw this as a movie?
It was David, and I mean David used to listen. I mean, the story of this film really begins with David because he used to listen to King George VI on the radio during the Second World War, and think, well, if the king can overcome a stammer, so can I, because he had this profound childhood stammer. And when he grew up and became a writer, he longed to write about it. At Cornell University, he had a first attempt, and it wasn't until he wrote Tucker, The Man in His Dream, that he felt he could turn to this passion project. And
Talk to us about the guy who built the cars.
Yeah, and he began to research and get some blips on the radar of, one Lionel Logue, speech therapist to the king, which of course fascinated him. He tracked down Valentine Logue, one of the sons we see in the movie, and Valentine revealed the existence of these diaries. And so David, wrote to the palace, and the Queen Mother wrote back to him and said, "Please, not in my lifetime. The memories of these events are still too painful." And so David waited, little realising the Queen Mother was going to live to 186. So it was many years later that he sat down to write it, and was intending to write a screenplay, got blocked on it as a screenplay, and then a close friend said, "Why don't you write it as an exercise, as a play, to simplify it?" And that was the form in which it was picked up by this tiny fringe theatre company in London. And that's how I came to it. I only came to the material because I happened to be half Australian, half English, living in London. My Australian.
But you knew it was a movie when you saw the play.
Yeah. Well, no, I didn't see the play. So my Australian mother was invited by Australian friends to go to this fringe theatre to make up part of the token Australian audience of this fringe theatre play reading of an unproduced play called The King's Speech. And my mother Meredith almost didn't go because it didn't sound exactly very promising. She's never been to a play reading in her life, but she only went to be, a good Australian in London and support this play. And she called me up and said, "I think I found your next film," and that's how it happened.
She said that?
Yeah. And for me, I'm as a half Australian, half Englishman, the film was very resonant because one of the major themes of my childhood was my Australian mother dealing with the effects on my father of his English upbringing. So let's just say I know a thing or two about an Aussie dealing with an Englishman's childhood.
And you knew this was your King George?
Absolutely. I mean, all my research into King George VI, I felt this was a man who was nice to his core, who was gentle to his core, had tremendous humility. And, when I thought about Colin, I mean, look, let's be honest, Colin doesn't look exactly like King George VI. I mean, he's a big strapping lad, and, and the real king was small and slight and quite sickly looking. But I felt this spiritual connection between the two men was more important because, Colin, and I don't want to embarrass him, but is nice to his core. As far as I can tell, he doesn't have a malign bone in his body. He's got tremendous humility and gentleness, and these character qualities or spiritual qualities I felt were much more important than the physical side in terms of making him appropriate to play this role.
How many roles have you gotten because of your spiritual side?
I didn't know it was showing.
So how do you approach this?
It looked like a fairly unscalable fortress at first, I think. The humanity of the character, I think, does strike you very early on in the process. But ways to research it are not easily available. Members of the royal family don't make themselves available for research purposes. If I were going to play a cab driver, I might spend a day with a cab driver.
You can't ring up the Queen and say, "Can I stop by and talk about your father?"
Exactly. Can I just hang out and watch you work for a day? And so that's, those avenues are closed. The flow of information out of the palace is non-existent to the rest of us. And so the source material is necessarily secondary. And there's quite a lot of that. A lot is written about it. These are the recesses of documented history, though. You've got to dig a bit here because, as we were talking just before the show, this is not the information that's put out there in the official version. Tom used to refer to the Wallace Simpson and Edward VIII story as history's A plot, if you like. We're focusing on the B plot.
Yes.
And it's a bit like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. You follow the minor character off stage and see what happens.
Yeah, okay, but explain that to us because it's fascinating to me. In fact, one of the things lines I loved in the film was when they quoted the last words of King George's father.
Bertie's, out of all my sons, Bertie's the only one who had any guts. It's a bit of a paraphrase.
He's got more guts than the rest of them put together.
He's got more guts than the rest of them.
But that's documented, I think.
And was he talking just simply about how he struggled with the stammering, or do you think he was talking about the fact that he, in his life, would be better prepared to be king than
it was
the
a sense
one
of
that's
duty
going to
that
get
his father had observed in his son. People were tearing their hair out about Edward VIII's behaviour, when he was still David.
Right.
It was going out of control.
It was having this affair with Wallace Simpson and wanted to marry her.
And it wasn't just that. He seemed to, there's a letter from his mother, Queen Mary, after the abdication, basically tearing a strip off him, saying, how could you betray centuries of responsibility and everybody depended on you? People lost their lives for the name of the crown. You know, she's going back to the First World War. People who've given up, made these massive sacrifices in the name of the king, and you're prepared to throw it away for a woman. You know, that was how it was viewed. People felt he was actually losing his reason. There will be different versions of this. There are apologists for David, for Edward VIII. Some of them very, very passionate and feel he was a great romantic figure. And I don't even weigh in on that argument. But
and what was the relationship between the two?
Well, I don't think they knew each other except intermittently, from what I understand. I think they went through phases where I know there's a letter where David says, I felt, it was just after World War I, where he said, I felt glad to have the opportunity to get to know my brother again. But very interestingly, Bertie had to, he was actually decommissioned from the Navy because of health problems, which were a result over long term of the nanny not feeding him, which is mentioned in our story as one of the abuses he had as a child. This produced a stomach ulcer. In the middle of the war, he had to go and convalesce at the castle of Balmoral, and his father at that time was convalescing from a riding accident. And they spent those 6 months getting to know each other. So actually, that was one little bit of warmth and light, I think, in terms of the parental, relationship. And I think that sense of learning to admire his son came out of that experience.
Here's a scene from the film. This is where the character you play, Bertie, has his first appointment with Lionel Logue, who is played by Jeffrey Rush, who is in fact the speech therapist who will change his life.
Aren't you going to start treating me, Dr. Logue?
Only if you're interested in being treated. Please. Call me Lionel.
I prefer Doctor.
I prefer Lionel. What'll I call you?
Your Royal Highness. Then Sir, after that.
How about Bertie?
Only my family uses Sir.
Perfect. In here, it's better if we're equals.
If we were equals, I wouldn't be here. I'd be at home with my wife, and no one would give a damn.
Well, please don't do that.
I'm sorry.
I believe sucking smoke into your lungs will kill you.
My physicians say it relaxes the throat.
They're idiots.
They've all been knighted.
Makes it official, then.
What makes this great for you?
What's extraordinary is, I mean, you have this man with a stammer who has to become king, kind of against his choice and almost against his will, right at the moment when radio has taken off as a mass medium, and the coming of this new medium has completely transfigured the monarchy, because before a king was a visual icon in English culture. You know, if he could wave from a carriage and look good in a uniform and look good on a horse, he could fulfill the role of king. And suddenly, with the coming of radio, you had to speak to the people, and not just the English people, but there were 58 countries in the British Empire when our film begins. And suddenly there is this pressure on a king to be able to connect emotionally. And if you think about all the analysis, of whether Obama is or isn't successfully connecting emotionally, he's the inheritor of the challenge that was thrown down by radio in the 1920s, because it doesn't matter whether the person in private is genuinely connected emotionally. It's does he appear to be connected emotionally when he performs?
Does his voice connect?
Yes, and to be faced with that new technology right in that 10-year window when it was only a live medium. I mean, it was the point where they couldn't pre-record, they couldn't edit out the stammers, it wasn't technically possible. To become king at that moment, with the Second World War approaching and the demands on him to connect with the English at such a tough time in the national psyche, was an extraordinary set of demands to be placed on him. And so many stories about kingship are about the seductions of power, the corruptions of power, and this is a story about reluctance in relation to power. I mean, he absolutely didn't want to be. He absolutely didn't want
was prepared to give it up.
Yeah, and then
the
who,
opportunity.
and then who knew the guy who'd get him through this was this wonderful maverick Australian, a failed Shakespearean actor, not a doctor, self-taught, who penetrates to the heart of the English establishment. And the English are pretty find therapy pretty hard to recognise even now, you know, and God knows how hard they would have found therapy to accept in the 1930s. And on top of that, there was a lot of snobbery attached to being Australian. I mean, my mother talks very much about the snobbery she encountered in the 60s when she arrived in England, so God knows what it was like in the 30s. And so, you know, but the deliciousness of the story is one feels it is only the outsider figure that could help him, that he's almost condemned to the fact that anyone from his own class and his own background would not be able to save him.
So what did you like about this?
You know, I think, listening to what Tom's saying, it's interesting that at that particular point in history, you have what looks like a perfect storm conspiring against this man. I mean, what could possibly be worse? You know, your greatest demon is to have to speak to anybody. And so this is his job. He's up. He's the first king ever to really have to do it, and the last one to ever have to do it unedited, unrecorded. So, you know, it's not a great piece of good fortune to land in that interval. And yet I think that there's an extraordinary paradox which is irresistible in terms of the inspirational elements of this story, that those catastrophes were somehow converted into something victorious, that he discovered virtues because he faced it, because he did it anyway. He actually found something that he would never have found. And I think that he connected. You know, there's the quote at the end of Beckett's Unnameable. What is it? I must go on, I can't go on. I'll go on. That's like watching him when he gets caught up in the storm.
Perhaps made him a better king.
I think it did. But it's very interesting to look at the values he represents. If you listen to the big speech in our film, where he's actually, you know, he's saying why we have to fight. And he's talking about the primitive doctrine that might is right. He's actually believable because he doesn't want might himself. You know, his adversary, you know, is not only a master of the microphone and can make use of this new medium to hypnotize the masses, he's also invading Poland, you know? This is a man who's prepared to commit mass murder in order to grasp power. And the population of Britain are listening to a leader who doesn't want it. And so they can believe him when he says that, you know, might is not the political answer. Right. And so they're connected, and I think that there was a sincerity, and people talk about the fact that they did feel he was speaking to them. And it's all very well if you're sitting in a living room which may at any moment be bombed, or you're grieving for a loved one, or you're in a hospital and you're struggling through the effects of war, and the person who's speaking to you is speaking from a gilded palace. You know, you just think, you know, what part of that connects to you? But they knew that this man, just to speak to them, was going through an enormous battle. And I think that probably was one of the things that facilitated that connection.
Let's take another look at you. This is talking of becoming the king. Here it is.
Everything all right? Let's get cracking.
I'm not here to rehearse, Dr. Logue. Call me Lionel. So you never called yourself doctor? I did that. No training, no diploma, no qualifications, just a great deal of nerve.
Lock me in the tower.
I would, if I could.
On what charge?
Fraud. With war looming, you've saddled this nation with a voiceless king. You've destroyed the happiness of my family, all for the sake of ensnaring a star patient you couldn't possibly hope to assist. It'll be like mad King George III. It'll be mad King George the Stammerer.
What was a challenge for you?
I think scoring that, you know, as I suggested before, you know, going through the evidence, you know, there are a lot of limitations on what you can really know. Right. So a lot of this was a journey of our imagination based on a lot of what our writer David Seidler could provide and what we ourselves could bring to it. But I think in some ways it was judging things. I felt that we could have gone very, very badly wrong in all kinds of directions. Right. The humour could have been misjudged. It's all too obvious to say what would have happened had the stammer been misjudged. You know, if that was grating or excessive or inauthentic in any way, we would have no film. It would have been an absolute catastrophe.
And so where did you go for that? I mean, just your own skill?
I honestly don't know. I mean, I've been waiting until this moment. This film hasn't come out yet, so I've been waiting to see whether anybody thinks it did come off. You know, David Seidler talked
the
about
buzz on this is very good.
Well, I'm hearing it, and I'm very gratified by it, and particularly when I hear from people who stammer themselves,
right, exactly.
you know, who are telling me that it resonates, and the sense of relief about that is palpable for me. But it's not just those things. I think I was very reliant on Tom to be vigilant about where marks could be overstepped. You know, the fear of self-pity, I think that could have killed us too. I think we could have ended up in a kind of, we could have been mired down in a sort of poor little rich boy account. You know, I look at me.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, we really had to understand something about where the damage came from. But when you have to hear that from the character himself, you have to be very, very careful. You know?
I mean, are you saying, which I kind of believe, is that you have to buy into this as an important story with consequences? Do you not?
Yes, but I think the interesting thing about stammering is that, you know, if you're a stammerer, in the moment of hitting that silence, the world falls away. Nothing else exists. I mean, if you're a stammerer, you don't need to be the King of England for it to be dramatic. You don't need to be facing Nazi Germany. It's a profoundly heightened state to be in, where every day becomes a negotiation of your fear of these silences. And I think what's so interesting about the film is Colin captures that personal drama, which is not global, and then suddenly this man suffering this personal drama is positioned in this global context where his personal drama is particularly unhelpful.
I was far more interested in watching how whatever evidence I could find, to see how he combats it, how he navigates his way out of it, and that told me about what kind of person he was. Far more than
what evidence did you find?
Well, we have film of it. There's not a lot of it. There's the recording. There are various recordings of his speeches, and funnily enough, some of the later speeches, the stammering is more evident than in the 1939 speech you hear in the film. Some of his later, there's a speech, I think, in 1943 or 44 to the Home Guard, where you actually hear that catch in the throat. And then there's the Wembley speech in 1938 in Glasgow.
Yeah.
And Tom and I both had the same reaction to this. There's a shot of him in profile talking to a very large crowd. And it wasn't so much wanting to understand what's happening technically to that part of the man's body. You know, that was something else I had to address. But it was actually seeing, if I were to slow it down in my mind, the mini narrative of what he's actually experiencing. I felt I could read the moment where he hit that wall, where that dismay comes over him when he hits the W of the word when. And you see him have another go. And to me, it's readable in his face that he's not going to be able to go on just by pushing. And then, so you see him having to collect himself. I mean, there's nothing more heartbreaking. You know, there's a man who actually in front of everyone has having to close his eyes and have a moment with himself, and heaven knows what he's wrestling with in that moment. It must be the loneliest thing in the world, and as Tom said, it's an abyss. I mean, everything has fallen away. You are in the deepest, darkest imaginable hole, and I think there's probably no foreseeable end to it. And yet he does come out of it, and you see his jaw working, you see his mouth going. You know, the signs of this private struggle in front of so many people, you know, are so readable. But he does come out of it, and then you see something else in him where he it's Beckett's "I'll go on," and he goes forward with the same dignity, the same pace, the same resolve that you saw in him before he hit that wall. And that's what told me about him. You know, I had to find what that seizure felt like, or what it was made from, as something personal only I could find. But what was really interesting to the rest of us, I think, is just what it told us about him, that he fought that battle in front of people on such a regular basis.
I mean, on Colin, you know, I can say this about Colin, which is that when I saw this, you know, 4-minute archive clip, I mean, I had tears in my eyes from this shaky little clip. And I, at that moment when I saw this, thought, actually, this is the solution to the stammer in this film is how the real king did it. I mean, his suffering is so poignant and so so humanises him immediately that I knew if Colin somehow caught the essence of it, we would be in a very powerful place. And Colin's extraordinary achievement, I don't think he's even conscious of how much he's done it, is he somehow bottled, internalised that what I felt the real king was going for, and that's why I'm so profoundly moved by what Colin does in the film, because he's caught that moment for moment navigation of this kind of hell of silence.
Congratulations. Thank you. Thank you. Great to see you again.
Thank you, Charlie.
The King's Speech opens November 26, Friday night.